The Washington Times dropped Senator Rand Paul's regular column this week after he was caught plagiarizing from other publications. What got less notice was Rand's implicit admission that much of his material was written by his staff, raising the more thorny issue of publishing ghostwritten op-eds. Kentucky Senator Rand Paul is not short on opinions.
You know, I think government is inherently inept.
And one venue for the senator's opinions has been the Washington Times, which has published a weekly column by him since the summer. But earlier this week, the website BuzzFeed found several columns contained passages lifted from other publications, including this one. By design, mandatory sentencing laws take discretion away from prosecutors and judges so as to impose harsh sentences regardless of circumstances. BuzzFeed also found Paul appears to have plagiarized several passages in his 2012 book, Government Bullies. In response, Paul blamed the pilfering on his staff.
Ultimately, I'm the boss and things go out under my name, and so it is my fault. But I would say that people need to also understand that, you know, I never have intentionally ever presented anyone's ideas as my own.
Washington Times editor John Solomon says the paper will no longer publish Rand's columns, but that they appreciate that the senator and his staff have taken responsibility. Maybe readers would also appreciate more transparent bylines. Yeah, John, we've noted this for years. I mean, you see John Kerry's name. I do think John Henry wrote that piece the other day, the 2,800-word one. I think he wrote that all by himself. But most of these senators, congressmen, they have staff writing these things. But there's no, you know, as told to or anything like that. It's always has their name on it. So there's a potential for this kind of thing. But you'd think somebody like Rand Paul would look at it and say, wait a second, where did this come from? Where did that idea come from?
I would just ask news editors, op-ed page editors everywhere a simple question. Why are you printing this stuff? First of all, even if it is written by them, they have ample, mostly taxpayer-funded resources to get their spin and their take out. Can't you reserve your precious space for people with a little less vested interest or for different voices that we otherwise wouldn't hear from? I think if you are going to run something by a Paul, you should insist that it be written by them and double check, you know, as best you can. It is reassuring, though, to know that Rand Paul's ideas are his own, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
You know, I wouldn't run op-eds from politicians unless they certified that they wrote it themselves, and I wouldn't double-check it. You put them in the position of either telling the truth or lying, and if you catch them lying, you
got a good story.
You have a good story, exactly. You know, one of the things this is reminiscent of is a little bit like father, like son. For years, Ron Paul put out newsletters, or somebody put out newsletters under his name that contained a number of white supremacist views. And when this was exposed, his answer was, well, I had no idea this was going on. And I mean, this sounds a little bit like that, except that Rand Paul seems to be taking a little bit more responsibility than his father did for the same type of thing. He
also blamed the haters for promoting this and everything. So that we put a tamer version on because he was basically saying that his haters were stirring this up, and that's why he lost his job.
And it's also because MSNBC was the first to identify it, particularly Rachel Maddow, and then it migrated to BuzzFeed and then Politico, and it sort of got to a point where he couldn't deny it anymore because it had become mainstream enough, sort of non-ideological enough to say, okay, but look at these two passages, they're exactly the same. So I think that is a really interesting thing, that the acknowledgement only came after this, the haters did this, and then it slid from there to, you know, to Politico, where he just couldn't deny it anymore. I think there's a real difference between writing speeches. Almost no politician in a very high office can write all their speeches, or that's all they would do all day, right? They couldn't do anything else. They couldn't think about anything else. They couldn't read any policy. They'd have to write their speeches all day. Between that and putting an op-ed with your byline, which should be like reserved for a special thing, like, wow, I really have something, a big deal thing to say, and putting it in a paper. When I read something from John Kerry, and I'm sorry for the naivete, I assume it's John Kerry, and I think it should be. And if you can't write an op-ed very often, then don't write one very often. Just write one when you're really burning up inside and you've got to say something.
Now, what's interesting about this is that I read this and I thought, well, doesn't everybody know that they don't write these? Because I realized that was a real insider kind of position. So I just assumed everybody knew they didn't write them. But what the op-eds represented was their highest and best take on an opinion or on an issue that they really felt strongly about. And so hence why a newspaper would print it or an online organization would print it, because let's say we've been talking, and now here's John Kerry saying, okay, this is from my highest and best response in the middle of this kind of discussion about whatever the issue is, and that's what I assume. But I think it's wrong, as I had thought about it, that people don't realize that it wasn't written by them.
Okay, here's a question for you, Ellie. Do you think Vladimir Putin wrote the op-eds that the New York Times
I actually did think he wrote.
So did I. What do you think?
He maybe had a little bit of help, but I think there was a lot of him in that.
Yeah. I mean, it didn't. Maybe because it wasn't as polished as I might have, thought if somebody had gussied it up around the edges. But I also don't think it's anything wrong with saying John Kerry and staff.
Exactly.
You could say that. That's not going to take away from my understanding of what you feel intensely about this particular issue. It just lets me know that you had staff go say, where's that ad about so-and-so, the one,
right,
and they go and get it.
I don't think you have to sit in a room monastically writing this thing. Even a random person who writes an op-ed may talk to people in their family or people at work about the issue over time. They write it themselves.
Yes, exactly.
But it's not like they haven't bounced ideas off their friend and said,
well,
what
I'm
do you
making a difference. I'm just talking about the writing now. So I'm just saying, if you're going to put your name on it, now that I think about it, I just assumed everybody knew.
Is it plagiarism if you put your name on it and somebody else wrote it?
The part of this story about Rand Paul that was obviously plagiarism when he lifted from other people. Since I know that he wasn't writing the op-ed to begin with, I didn't think of it as plagiarism. But as I said now, I think you should say.
Well, then you also run into this problem of what if the person who writes it for you is a plagiarizer?
Well,
You're
that's
not.
Right.
That's right. That's what happened to him.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, but at this point, I don't think he should have thrown the staff under the bus.
No.
I think he should have said, look, that we shouldn't have been doing it that way, so I take responsibility in the story.
They never throw themselves under the bus.